Hello and welcome to another episode of the Learned Live Lounge. Cool name, I know. Today I am joined by Steve Dempsey. Steve is the General Counsel at Amalgamated Metals Corporation, a position he's held for the last 6.5 years. He's also a NED and chairman for Unseen Tours. Prior to that, Steve was a corporate lawyer in private practice for his sins. Thank you so much for joining me, Steve. How are you today?
Good, thank you, Phil, and thank you for having me on. Looking forward to talking things through. And yeah, it feels like a long time ago, those corporate days. So thank you for
Yeah,
reminding me of that.
it does. Thank you for bringing it back up. Absolutely, my pleasure. We've got there's a couple of things we wanted to cover on this session. So one of the reasons I was really keen to have you on is we wanted to talk about what the general counsel role looks like actually at the point that it's developed to some extent. So what's quite interesting about your experience is when you took on the role at AMC, it was in effect a newly created position in what it was. And naturally, 6+ years in, it's very different, I imagine. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very different now to how it was when you first started. And it's that element we're quite interested in because a lot of the time we get, I think, advice, information, guidance for senior counsels looking to step up into a first hire greenfield site general counsel role, and there's a lot that one can do in their first 100 days, and there's lots of advice around that. What they don't tell you is once the relationships are developed, once the function is established, how do you kind of keep it doing what it needs to do, adapts as the business adapts, and how do you build on that influence and keep kind of maturing the function in the
Yeah,
right way. That's the premise anyway.
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one. Look, I think you make an interesting point, right? Which is, for a variety of reasons, I think there's a lot of focus in LinkedIn and YouTube and everything else and podcasts around what do you do for the first 90 days,
Yes.
100 days, and how do you survive the first 6 months and all that.
Yes.
And that isn't to say that stuff isn't important. Getting off to a strong start always helps. But it's funny how quickly the 10 steps of success only get you, funny enough, 10 steps. And then the
And then
whole,
that's
the
it.
whole road to
Then
walk
you're
down
on your own.
really does seem to be sort of every man for themselves. So,
Yeah.
it's a good thing, I think, to talk about, particularly a lot of the time, and perhaps I'm being, slightly cheeky here and saying, unsurprisingly, you'll know people who move jobs possibly quite frequently, and there's in looking at a liquid market, and people don't really think about kind of how a
Yeah.
career in one organization works over 5-6 years or beyond. So hopefully for anybody who is sitting there going, I've just got in and I've ticked my 10 steps or I'm,
Yeah.
after a year, what do I do now? Something that I say will make some sort of sense and have some value to it.
Yeah, I absolutely, and it's not cheeky of you to say, because this is definitely another not issue per se. I mean, a transient market's a good market as well, but the reason that people will stay within an organization is because there's development, there's growth, and there's things going on. And what we want to understand is what your role is as part of that and what you've been able to do. So I guess let's start with this concept then. Well, not concept, it's something we see, but this idea of the transition from legal advisor to strategic partner. Now, we obviously can sit here and theorize about what in-house counsel is there to do, and we know those different elements or layers and levels of role and what they're intended to do. But I guess I'm interested in looking back on those early days when you're coming in and proving the role and operationally managing and dealing with lots of things and some skeletons that were probably hidden somewhere that needed to be dealt with quite quickly. And actually now, 6 years later, where that really pivots, at what point that pivots and what that looks like and how you're part of that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it ties into quite a few different things that most in-house lawyers will come across in one form or another, even potentially without realizing it.
Mm.
And the first thing I'd probably say is exactly what you think your role should be, versus what your team think your role should be, versus what your organization holistically think your role should be, can be quite different. And also, they are not necessarily fixed in stone. There will, I'm sure, be people who go, well, the lawyer does the NDAs and they sit in the corner and that's great, crack on and have a great time. But there'll be other people who will evolve their own thinking about what your role is capable of doing based on how you do it. And I think that's always worth bearing in mind from early days is you're not going to be able to go in on day one to any organization and say, this is the job I've taken and this is how it is going to be done, because that ultimately leads to a very inflexible environment, which I think really it struggles to build the goodwill you're going to need to get on to that point around having influence later down the road. But what you are able to do is to demonstrate what your technical skill from day one, how it can be applied in a way that gives you that goodwill and that credibility towards molding something where ideally there's sort of a Venn diagram where their idea of what the great lawyer is and your idea of what your role should be have a big degree of overlap. I'm sure there will still be bits that both sides are more keen on than others, but that's where you're trying to get to, and I think there's that transition from advisor to partner kind of comes through. I would call it a question evolution. And this kind of takes me back to when I started as an in-house lawyer. When you first come in, particularly in an organization that doesn't have an existing legal function, the question is usually, how do you do something? Someone will come to you and say, this is what we are going to do. How do you do it? What document do I need to sign? Or is this term okay? And ultimately, when you first start, really, your goodwill will get you some questions to understand how that works and what therefore the right advice is. But your ability to influence the actual decision is relatively limited because you need to demonstrate your understanding of the business, and that needs to mature and all those sensible things. Over time, that does evolve. Hopefully, if things are going well, if you're executing well, if the things you are saying that they should do, they are doing, and it is proving to be in the right area. It then goes from, I think, how do we do this to can we do this? I.e., they're starting to understand that the question they should be asking you isn't just about execution, but it's thinking about wider sensitivities for the business. Yes, of course, the legal is certainly to begin with going to be the most immediate in their mind when they're asking that question. But as soon as you have a slightly broader question to answer, you can provide a slightly broader response and start feeding in other things that you think about, whether that's the purely commercial, reputational, other ancillary parts that are all part of essentially making sensible business decision. And then if that all goes well, hopefully you get to, should we do this? And that's where I see the GC that you want to be generally. I think most GCs sit there and say, well, where I want to be is in the room deciding what we should be doing as much as how we do it. And when you get to that point, that is the broadest question and is really the one where ultimately, yes, your legal expertise is probably appreciated, but it's not really what people are coming to you for. I mean, that's the distinction in my mind between your general counsel and the partner of the law firm you use all the time, which is ultimately at this point, you are someone who is involved with in an intimate way and understands the culture of the organization. And actually, that's really where your value comes. Yes, it has a legal overlay, but it does have a much more holistic point around people having faith in your judgment and that it's in keeping with the culture that you are both part of. And that really is when you know that you've gone to that strategic partner role rather than the legal executor.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It's a really interesting way of framing it around the question that is asked and the breadth of it. I often typify that transition as and you see it in sort of senior lawyers' careers as well, where they move between roles that give them that development. When you move from being a senior counsel to taking a head of position, and it's that you're there as one of the business stakeholders who happens to have a legal hat. It's that element to not this is the lawyer in the room and that's the intent. It's a foundation for why some of the questions might be being asked and where the advice is coming from, and it is to also always still have the execution element of how do we do this. There's still that will always be the case, but it as you say, it moves on to these other spaces. This is a bit of a tricky one because it's not really a fair question. I think it's so dependent. But when does that transition happen? Is there a time frame that we think like within a year, it should be? Or I know it's so dependent, but I kind of interested to get your thoughts. It's something people ask a lot about the development of the roles.
It's a really interesting question, and I think the most obvious one to answer in the most unhelpfully lawyery way possible in saying it depends. but I'm going to try and avoid that kind of that temptation, just to leave it at that. No, I think it is. I don't think there is a checkpoint where you say, I have been here for 18 months and I need to be in
I've
those
done it.
conversations.
Yeah,
There are certainly things you can do to, I think, accelerate the timetable for being in a position to have that role and to have those conversations. For example, I mean, some of these are things that, lots of people will be familiar with. Finding a way into the room in the first place, often for some organizations, is half the battle, right? And whether that's
absolutely.
picking a company secretarial role or asking if you can be essentially a board attendee, even if not a board member, and getting yourself in a position where you're actually equipped to understand not just the kind of the factual information around how the business operates and what its sensitivities are, but also how those are managed and digested culturally within the organization by senior leaders. That is one of the key things you need to have. That is the arsenal you have to be able to be part of those conversations at all. For me, I think I've been quite lucky in that I've managed to have a culture where I think when I first came into our organization at AMC, we had similar values anyway. And actually, I think most people, when they take a job, one of the reasons they take the job is because I think this institution and this organization is aligned with how I think about things.
Yeah.
Hopefully some of this is quite natural, but it's not a straight line or a predictable curve. Things will come up which have potentially a naturally more legal bent to them, and that might be your foot in the door moment,
Opportunity.
for lack of a better phrase.
Yes.
And other times it will just be because over time, those relationships with directors, with the key people at strategic level, naturally just firm up, and that goodwill grows. So I think the takeaways I give to people who are thinking about this is, ask yourself honestly how you think it's going, kind of on an iterative basis, not to test yourself and say I'm failing because, I didn't get to participate in X, Y, and Z in Q1 or Q2, but just so you have a self-awareness about where your areas of influence are and where you would like them to be, because that's also important. Some people are in some organizations being, more focused on compliance related management and personnel is a huge ask in itself. And actually is an area where you can have a huge amount of influence and people find rewarding. In others, it will be for smaller organizations, a whole board is what they really want to be exposed to and where they want to be. So it's having that self-awareness to allow yourself to manage that curve in a way that works for you. And then the other thing I would say is, don't get discouraged by it, because it is one of the things, where ultimately it isn't straightforward. It is to do with essentially human behavior as much as business behavior. And those things are, as we all know, erratic. And sometimes things can, come and get, appear out of nowhere. And suddenly you find yourself in meetings where you think, I'm not really sure I should be in this meeting at the moment, but I'm going to give it a go. And if you give yourself that kind of good grace, you can be surprised where you end up over 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and even your even your initial point on that, which on the face of it is quite an obvious one, but actually it's worth understanding a bit more. The access to the information and the access to the room, and it's exactly why in our vertical, the company secretarial piece is often quite an interesting one as part of that, because it has a natural attendance for some of those crucial elements. And I think you're also right. I've seen this a lot with the development of people's roles, and when they're starting out early on, and the ones that maybe there's an element of luck and it's right place, right time as well, but they walk into an organization and there's suddenly kind of some very big ticket item, whether it's a particularly nasty piece of litigation or I don't know, some sort of very politically turmoiled employment issue. It's something that just naturally makes everyone look towards the legal role, and it is then opportunity, frankly, to say, okay, well, now we can start doing this, and the relationship always then sets from there. It never goes back to, oh, when you started, we just wanted you here and do these contracts, and don't really get too involved. As soon as you're in and you're in the room and you're having the conversations, as long as it's going well, it tends to grow.
I think that's right, Phil. But and also, to be honest, even when it's not going well, you learn a lot
Yeah,
about your colleagues and how the organization works when things are not going to plan.
that's very
Um,
true.
and particularly in, for better or for worse, a lot of the time, as GC, you are dealing with things that have not gone well. That is the nature of the beast sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's how you manage that, being the calm head in the room who understands the technicals and can translate them into what is real term risk. That is not easy to do unless you've actually been in that situation already. So, for instance, I started my in-house career, I think a month before COVID lockdowns began. And
Yes,
so
of
actually in
course.
terms of,
Yeah.
for an institution that was was looking for a first in-house hire for quite some time, um, there are a lot of questions that came out of that, as I'm sure we all, anyone who's listening to this will be like, yeah, I remember those questions. And ultimately, in one sense, that was a real opportunity. And
Mm,
some of those questions, I think we answered very quickly and very capably. Others took us longer to get our heads around as a team, and that included from a legal side.
mm.
Um, there is no good or bad, no definitively good or bad outcome to either of those. But the more of those types of processes you're in, the more scenarios your leadership team see you in, good and bad, the more faith they are hopefully going to have in your ability to manage those and therefore be part of the conversation at a strategic level.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the thing that is a shock to no one to recognise is that foundationally behind all of this and the role and the development and the work that you're doing, it's the relationships that sit at the underside. And I see this on the other side of things where roles aren't working, where people aren't fulfilled or are moving or are leaving. It is in certainly the majority of cases at this level with these kinds of roles, general counsel roles, in the majority of cases, it's where there is a disconnect with various members of the C-suite in whatever form that takes. That's the reason where the role becomes kind of untenable or not workable anymore. So we know that the relationship piece is the foundation to this. So I wanted to explore that element a bit more because it's far too simplistic to say, okay, so the way to develop this role and the way that it naturally develops is everyone likes you, so just be nice to everyone. And then, okay, that's it. Now they all like you. And then that's it. The role develops. There's much more, I think, behind the scenes about how you curate some of those relationships. I'm interested to get your take on that. And I know it's a bit nuanced.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting challenge, but I think it's one that really is one that being an in-house lawyer is a good environment in which to take that challenge on, right? Because people often say, sometimes being a lawyer can be a bit more like being a therapist. People come and talk to you, and actually, do I have any legal answers for you? Not really. I'm just here to sort of absorb the woes of the
The
world.
frustration. Yeah.
And I'm sure that's the same across many organizations, and sometimes it'll be HR and sometimes it'll be lawyers. But there are
Mm,
natural people who fulfill roles that I think,
mm,
whether it's because they're roles that naturally involve a large amount of information absorption and interpersonal
mhm,
management, give you those opportunities to be not to be a technical person, but to essentially just be a sympathetic ear to hear how other people are struggling with certain aspects of business, and that urge when these conversations first start happening is to be like, great, this is my chance to give some one-to-one advice, and that's really what I should be doing, and so I can start leveraging this. No, I think the reality is most of the time, frankly, I think the best answer for us is, well, what do you want to do? It's a case of letting people talk themselves through things with you and being
mm.
that sounding board for things, and it is actually a very involved role, even if you're not saying very much. And if you do that over time, it doesn't mean, as you say, it's not about saying everybody who comes in every idea they have is a great idea. Sometimes it's saying, I think that sounds sensible. Sometimes it's saying you might want to rethink it. And actually, sometimes it's not even giving an opinion at all. It's about giving people that environment in which you can be reactive to them and show that you are understanding, even if you're not agreeing with. At least you are understanding where they're coming from, and that's where those relationships come from, I think.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and it's especially around the temptation. Certainly, is here's my opportunity, and I've got to showcase. I think I don't know. Maybe it harks back to just the way that um, the way that lawyers are trained even. Because, if we think about traditionalist training and what that looks like, and then how that is and isn't fit for purpose when we talk about senior in-house roles, it's not like, I don't think the law firms are looking at their trainees and trying to give them the skill set that makes them an excellent general counsel. They're trying to give them the skill set that, I guess, in theory, one day makes them an excellent partner. Certainly, and then initially, just makes them a good associate. And it's the knowing when it's not that you need to showcase extensive knowledge, or I can cover this area, or I know exactly what this looks like. Sometimes it's just, as you say, listening, or and even not even offering an opinion
Yeah,
at all.
yeah, I think that's right. And I'm conscious that of the people listening to this, there will be some who have potentially just come out of private practice or are still in private practice. Some have been GCs for 10 years and some have been GCs for 10 weeks. And so some of this will apply to a greater or lesser extent. But if you think about kind of the usual operating model for a private practice law firm, your time is literally on the clock. You are measured by
Yeah,
the output you give in a very tangible way, which is
yeah,
what advice are you giving on specific questions that have been raised. That isn't the world of being an in-house lawyer. I would say, thank God, but that's the reality of it. It's a very different environment. Yeah, the substance of law is still there, but it's a more holistic role, and that gives you the time and bandwidth, I think, to take that wider approach of saying sometimes it's the softer side that you need to focus on, and actually over the longer term, it's where more value comes through.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and again, it's all about driving this and trying to build it forward on that theme, especially as well. And this is the uniqueness we get by looking at a role that's developed over a number of years. Naturally, businesses aren't static. Well, not generally anyway. There's movement, there's growth, there's changes. When the business is pivoting or growing or doing something substantively different, how does one, as the legal function, make sure that you're fit for purpose, that you're following that journey, that you're aligning with what that looks like? I.e., when the business changes, what are you guys doing to make sure you're part of that journey?
So it's a good question, and I think it's one that takes a lot of thinking through, because I often think there's this instinct, at least initially in house, to be very reactive to things that come in, and that it's an easy way to demonstrate value. Something has changed. I have done something because of that change. Okay, it makes sense as an equation, but it's not necessarily the right way, I think, to look at sustaining long-term growth and legacy of a legal team when the business is evolving over time or even very quickly. As you, I mean, Phil, I have a very short attention span and can only do things in three as a maximum. So I tend to go for essentially three questions, which whenever there is a change or a strategy that comes in, I think are quite helpful to ask the business, and indeed to ask yourself as the legal function, to try and make sure that those things are moving in sympathy with each other. So what's the objective? What does success look like? And how do we get there? Because if you go through each of those in sequence, it really helps understand the sort of the discipline of thought that's gone in from a business side, and therefore where some of the challenges that haven't quite been thought through might be, or where there are opportunities to look at things in a different way are. And then also looking at that from a legal team, again, asking yourself the same questions independently with that knowledge from that first exercise allows you to see, right, well, if the objective is to, I don't know, IPO in 18 months, what does success look like? It probably means that you don't want to be having to reorganize your entire legal and audit function 2 weeks before you're supposed to be launching an IPO. What it probably means today is thinking about contract management, company secretarial workloads, reporting schedules in a timely way. And how do you get there? Well, that's the question, which comes back to the execution point, and actually is the final question you ask. Because what you really want to be focusing on to begin with is the objective, and what would a good outcome look like for you and for the business. If you can go through those questions, they're not easy questions, I'd say, to answer. To be clear, I think a lot of the time it can feel like you're putting the project on hold, because that takes some digging and some soul searching for everybody involved. But I've always found that when you go through that in a more rigorous way, you save time in the long term in terms of miscommunications, misunderstandings and assumptions, and making sure that everyone is moving in the right direction together, rather than as separate parts of one business.
Yeah, I think that's the point, and it all ties in because it's about having visibility, and it's the constant calibration on that, and this is what helps to move things forward. I think a really important point, because again, the temptation can be to add value where here's the change, so reactively, here's the response, this is what we'll do, but it's about trying to be 2 or 3 steps further
Yeah.
ahead than
I mean,
that.
it's the age old one that most, almost everyone who's worked in in-house legal, or who is yet to, but is going to, will become familiar with, which is the sales contract that comes in at midnight and it needs to be signed at 9 a.m. the day after, right? It's urgent, it's urgent. Well, okay, you could do it urgently and, wake yourself up at 1 in the morning and sort it out. But ultimately, yes, that's achieved a short-term
Yeah,
fix. Potentially it's achieved a short-term fix, but it's not really addressing a long-term misalignment in how the business as a whole should
in
be
what
operating.
happened.
And
Yeah.
that frankly, there's a real risk there that you as the legal function become that kind of sweep up for all of the things that don't get thought about in advance. And that's really something that, certainly if you are from a small legal team who's growing,
Mm,
you can lose a lot of time and capacity in that. So
mm.
actually trying to get some discipline around objectives and strategy across the people you work with is really worth the time and effort up front.
Yeah, completely. And actually, there's an interesting point in that too. Even just when we're thinking from the viewpoint of workflow and capacity and all the rest of it, one other element to this role and the development and how things change over time is looking at actually the overall structure of the team. Now, I'm not specifically talking here about empire building, but as the role naturally develops, it's pretty commonplace that additional resources acquired from different, but whether that's an uptick in external advice that's happening, because the fact is, once you're in and you're in the door and you can see what's going on, you find the areas that actually do need more TLC, whether that's internal support or external. But I guess onto the wider question of legacy, kind of mentorship, succession planning. If we're thinking about uh, our established functions already, and then how we're looking at it from a more long-termism perspective, what does that look like 6 years in? What I guess also in terms of timelines, at what point are we trying to build these things out? And it's not as simple as just, when do you need to hire your next lawyer so you can free yourself up? But what does that look like?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because you're going to spot a theme here, Phil, which is, again, I go to a different set of questions, and actually I think there's these ones are interesting, particularly at the moment with this kind of flux state around. Sorry, it was going to come up eventually. It's sort of like, it's lawyers bingo, isn't it? AI was going to come up at some
I
point. So
nearly mentioned it,
I
so
may as
we're
well
good.
just say it, and then we can all kick it off, and we can all move on.
Yeah.
But it is that thing which is, there are sort of, it's about, I think, understanding or having a view on decision making, in the sense of,
Hmm.
what do you want the people in your team, including you, um, to be doing in terms of decision making, and to unpack that, I think there are three things that kind of go into what is the nature of decision, and who should be making it. One is the significance of the subject matter. What I have for lunch versus whether you should list, slightly different in terms of level of impact, albeit one matters more to me at times than other. The
Yeah.
other one, the next one on this is, how long does the impact of that decision last? Again, use those two examples. An IPO could be for, 30, 40, 50 years until it goes
Mm.
private again and all the business winds up. I think lunch has a naturally more limited time frame. And then the third one, and I think it's a really important one to ask, is, if I make this decision, or if a person makes a decision, is somebody else essentially just going to override that decision anyway? Am I just making a decision that somebody else is going to re-look at and go, no, actually, I don't think we should do it that way, do it differently. Um, and if you have your team, or what you're thinking to do with your legal team and your legal structure, and you can go through the planned roles and the people you have and say, well, what decisions do I want them to make? Am I going to re-look at those holistically, or just the high level bits? Is it going to matter if they get that right or wrong? And if so, for how
Mm.
long? It really helps you understand what you're how to build a sustainable legal function for the business you are in. Because what might feel in one environment as a very bullish approach on decision making, you have two lawyers. One of them is a regulatory expert, because everyone's an expert on everything these days in AI. You know, and you let them take all decisions about that, and they have no oversight. In one environment, an FCA regulated business, that seems like a very aggressive approach to structuring a team.
Yeah.
In a business that has a much lighter regulatory context to it, that might be entirely justified. But again, if you don't ask yourself those questions and you don't test what the expectations are for roles and for functions within your organization, you can walk yourself into blind alleys and put resource in the wrong place, or put focus in areas where actually, even if it solves a problem day one, it's not a sustainable solution. From my own experience, it is worth trying different things. Sometimes you do have to say, I don't know the answer, but that allows you to approach hiring or new tech or whatever it might be with a view to, I need something short term to test. And so you're not committing to bringing in, a deputy GC, for, hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, only 2 months into their probation to decide it's the wrong move. If you don't go through those questions, sometimes I think there's a risk that you miss those kind of obvious points, which is your known unknowns and things where you've got a firmer idea. And if you can sort those out in your head, it makes you, or gives you the tools, I think, to make decisions that are likely to be the most sustainable in the long run.
I think that's so true. And also I think it comes down to this same point when we're talking about team structuring, and even just I guess workflow, or how we triage things. It's reactivity as opposed to proactivity. I've seen it in the context of hiring in my world, where you can tell where the hire is triggered from. There's just this uptick of work. There's just this amount of work here, and let's do this thing because that fixes that one problem. But if you haven't done, if I can coin it, your questions test on what that's trying to do and what the long term is on that. Yes, it fixes the problem there in its immediacy, but is that how you're actually deliberately trying to structure the function going forward? And it's the exact same thing with the investment of technology. I think the challenge with that side, a slight aside here, but the challenge with that side right now is there's so much noise out there on legal tech that I really feel that people have this kind of FOMO element of, oh, everyone's invested in it and we should have something. And I don't know if this is true, but it seems to be that businesses are quite open to making the investment on the technology. So, you can't get budget for new hires. You can't get budget to do that kind of these other things. But, oh, do you want some legal tech or some AI? Yes, yeah, absolutely. We should do that because that's the future and everyone's doing it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, look, I think I'll enjoy this tangent for a minute. And you tell me when you want to stop talking about tech. But it's it's an interesting one in the sense that I think there is going to come a point where the 400 different legal techs that are currently out there that all claim to be able to do everything broadly that everybody else can do are going to consolidate, and then there will be a very different discussion about deployment of technology in a legal environment. That being said, you're right. It is surprising how much easier it is sometimes to have a conversation about software rather than people. And that's, I suspect that's because historically lots of businesses have had more issues with people than they've had with software as much as anything else. This is just me sort of, sort of thinking aloud, but I sometimes feel it's the easy get out from a business.
Yeah.
Go and spend £15,000
on a bit of software. I guess there's a price point bit with it as well. And maybe it's the humanity element. I suppose, do we all just innately feel if you're involving humans, whether it's a hire or a temporary thing, or even, procuring external advice, but from a human, there's that, we need to be sure that we need this and want this, because almost you don't want to let people down, or you don't want to, we've got to be committed. Whereas if it's software and you just change your mind, okay, it's a bit of a shame, it's a waste of money, but you just press the button, you turn it off, and then it's I've not hurt anyone other than my wallet slightly. So is there an element there? Maybe.
And I think that, that ties into the point I make around where this is going, because as these things become more fully integrated into your business, actually, they will become, perhaps
Yeah.
parallels will start to shrink. Start to merge, because it won't be as easy as just saying, well, I'm not going to use, chat GPT anymore, because actually it will already be inherently part of your business operation. So I think we are at a point where things are moving so quickly in the technology field that it feels like an easy win to say, put something in so that we can tell people we've got something.
Yeah.
Um, and yes, there are some immediate benefits in terms of, okay, I've got something that can manage my calendar and it tells me when this is happening. And if I want to look up a legal thing that I've never heard of before, I get an answer that sounds really compelling, even if it's totally fictional.
This
Um, and
hallucination. Yeah.
but it's very easy day one.
Mm.
And currently, certainly, it depends on your industry, of course it does. For those who are more tech based, they'll tell me that this is a gross oversimplification, and I accept that that's true. But if you're, say, in a more industrial function, you could conceivably pick up and play with legal AI products and put them down again, a new one every month. And it probably wouldn't make a huge amount of difference to how you operate. I think it's an
Yeah.
easy way to avoid harder conversations. And perhaps that's
Yeah.
why it's for the time being, also an easier door to open.
I I I think that's a really, really good point. Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. I think it's it's an easy way to avoid actually slightly harder conversations. Let's not carry on down the tangent of AI, because we'll do the thing that everyone does, and we'll end up going and talking about how it's all an existential crisis and there's loads to discuss. I I'd like to conclude a little bit just by asking you, so look, 6.5 years in now, we're speaking to someone who is maybe a year into their their GC role, so it's in a much earlier form. Because of the experience that you've now got of running and doing this, what piece of advice would you give someone at that stage, or what's one kind of really crucial thing that they should be focusing on or paying attention to that's going to make that successful years down the line?
So I think there is um, a real value in essentially going with your gut. The
Right.
key thing, I think, if you're going to end up building a function that's sustainable and being in a role where you're a highly impactful member of management as a GC, um, that doesn't happen if the cultural fit isn't right. And actually, cultures do change over time. That is true. But ultimately, absent a takeover or a large seismic event in a corporate life cycle, the culture that you find on day one is likely to bear some significant resemblance to what you have in year six. And if you are finding early on that the culture is something you are comfortable with, even if you're not having a huge amount of say in terms of guiding the ship generally and exerting influence over broader corporate governance and all the things that you want to get to eventually. If the culture is there and you understand it, and your points of communality are strong enough, it will come.
Yeah.
I would say I would say with some confidence that it is, that is the hardest part. It's finding an organization where you have that uh, ground for goodwill to grow, for lack of a better word. And I think there's no formula to work that out. I think it is just being in the organization.
Yeah.
I start, when we first started talking, I said everybody does their 90 days, go and talk to the head of every department and do this and do that. And all of that, is entirely correct. But part of the reason why that's a good thing to do, aside from getting to know the business, is it's getting to know the business culture distinct from
Mm.
what it actually does. And if you come out of your first 90 days and go, well, I think everyone here is totally bonkers, and like, this is not how I would run anything at all, you might find that journey to a mature GC much more challenging than somebody else. You might be up for that challenge. It depends on where you are in your professional journey.
Yeah.
But you need to have a feel for that culture and see where you stand with it, and be self-aware enough to know where it's a good fit and where it's not a good fit, and whether that balance is right for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And it's interesting because it mirrors the advice that I give to lawyers looking at whether they're going to take the GC job at the start of it, which is, what is your sense of the culture, and go with your gut on this, because generally speaking, it's gonna, if it's telling you it's probably this. And like you said, it's not that you come away from that and say, well, look, you can't scale this, or it's not going to go the distance. It's just the level of difficulty or challenge sometimes that will come with that. And, you know, are you the right person? Are you going to be up for doing that? And what does that look like? Yeah, very interesting. In the interest of time, we will close the curtains, but thank you so much for joining me. I genuinely appreciate it. It's very kind of you. It's really interesting to get your insight on this. It's good topics. It's stuff that I think people don't talk about so much. But I appreciate your time doing it. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. And I'll speak to you again very soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.